Hello, Pod Smashers of the Internet, and welcome to another episode of
80-Bit Pod Smash,
where gaming goes to grab a beer. We are your hosts.
Penguin and Termite. I am Penguin.
I am Termite, and we are a weekly video game podcast smashing together ideas that you care about with video games.
That's right, and tonight the idea that we are talking about, the topic we are talking about is game endings. How should games end? What are all the different ways that games do end? What about these games that don't end? And we'll be talking about all of those variations of things. It's a pretty big topic, so hopefully we'll be able to talk about it in good, efficient time. But we are where gaming goes to grab a beer. So before we get into game endings, let's talk about what we're drinking. I am drinking my last Star Hill Festi, the Oktoberfest lager I had last week. Smooth and malty with a clean finish. This is our tribute to the German tradition of Marzen lagers. I think last week I mentioned that I was like, it tastes like a lager to me. I'm not like Sam Adams is just a hard Oktoberfest to beat. And every year I think I see these microbreweries that are like, oh, sweet, Star Hill did one. That certainly is going to be better than October. Nope, not better than Sam Adams. Every time. It's like, all right, okay. So
have you tried Sierra Nevada's Oktoberfest? Yeah,
I think so. And I don't have like any remarkable thought. Like, I think Sam Adams just nails the flavors that I'm looking for in an Oktoberfest. I'm sure there are microbreweries out there. I'm sure there are craft breweries out there that make great Oktoberfests that rival Sam Adams. But Sam Adams being so widely available, I'm like, yeah, they do so well with it.
I don't have the time to look the beer up because it was a crazy German name. Last year, we went to an Oktoberfest event in the before times when we could gather.
Oh my gosh.
And we met in the parking lot of Harry's Ale House, which is a local tap house to us.
I remember that.
And the brewer had gotten a small limited barrel directly from Germany, and I cannot remember the name of this beer. It was the best Oktoberfest by far. Obviously coming right from Germany with all of the ingredients and the recipe that stems all the way back to like, I don't even know, 16th century? Who knows? I have no idea. It was absolutely out of this world amazing. And it was expensive, and I drank like 2 or 3 of them, and they were amazing. But anyway, that's a beer that's better than Sam Adams. That's Fair not enough. What I'm drinking tonight.
So what did you drink?
What am I drinking tonight is Aleworks from Williamsburg's Pumpkin Seasonal Selection. Have you had that this year yet?
No, I haven't. I've had Aleworks before, and they're actually surprisingly good. I thought there were just some cash. I went to Williamsburg for Christmas the first year we were married. My wife and I went to Williamsburg literally on Christmas. It was actually really very, very much fun. And I grabbed some Aleworks, and I totally thought it was like a cash grab. Like, this is just some brewery they put together to cash in on all that delicious Colonial Williamsburg, money. No, it's actually a genuinely good craft brewery. They make some good stuff.
They're amazing. So, yes. So their pumpkin ale is one of the ones that there's a lot of pumpkin beer, a lot of pumpkin ales that are bad. They are too sweet. They have the fake flavors. They're pumpkin spiced and not actual pumpkin beers. But there are 2 that stand out to me every single year.
If you like that, though.
Right. I mean, yeah, if you like that stuff, then yes. But I'm just saying, I'm trying to express like a positive note for the authenticity and the genuineness of this beer. But this is Aleworks' pumpkin beer. It is kind of sweet. It has the pumpkin spicy flavors you would know, but this is a quality craft beer. It's this one and Dogfish Head's Pumpkin, which I had a couple weeks ago on this show, and now I am enjoying this. It is the perfect time of year. The weather is crisp. It is cold, and when this says on the label, pumpkin pie in a bottle, it's really good. It sounds like it could be, like you said, a little gimmicky cash grab. Ooh, pumpkin pie in a beer. And you could be turned off by that, but I promise you, Aleworks Brewing Company's Pumpkin Seasonal Selection is amazing. It is a spiced amber ale. So
have to give it a shot.
Maybe go get that.
See if I can grab it at like Total Wine or something. If I'm ever.
I brought it with me to the beach that we went to 2 years ago. If you remember that, when we stayed at that beach house.
Yes, I do remember that. I remember it being delicious then. So, oh gosh, we gotta do that again. When
don't we?
We don't risk infecting each other with a potentially harmful illness. All right, well, moving on from that sour note, welcome to 80-Bits Pod Smash. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome. We are going to be talking about stuff. For those who are familiar with us, you may be wondering, and maybe haven't been for the last few episodes, you may be wondering where our news section is, because we are not going to be covering news today. We are now doing that in an entirely separate format, an entirely separate medium. We stream a live news show every Monday at twitch.tv/80bit pod smash. So every Monday night, this episode will drop at midnight. And so if you're listening to this episode Monday, check us out tonight at 8 p.m. We will be doing another live show where we will be covering the recent news. But because we record 2 weeks in advance of all of our episodes, we kind of got sick of covering the news late. So now we will be all up to date with the news as opposed to covering it late. So that's kind of our primary motivation.
It's more relevant. We're hitting the news fresh when it's hot off the iron. And you guys get to interact with us on twitch.tv's chat. So you can ask us questions. You can correct us on the fly. You don't have to wait 2 weeks to hear our take on a piece of news. So definitely check us out tonight, 8 p.m., twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash. If you can't join us live, the videos will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And there's no actual easy link to our YouTube channel, unfortunately. So you just have to go into YouTube and type Penguin and Termite, and you'll find us. And the video will be on demand.
I bet you if you search 80-Bit Podsmash, you'll be able to find us too, but we'll verify that.
It is on 80bitpodsmash.com. There's a link to our YouTube there as well.
Perfect. Yeah, that's probably the easiest way to get to it then. So, all right, cool. Yep. Well, then, unless you have any opening thoughts or banter to highlight, then we can move on to our next segment, but I'll give you a chance.
He's a bit of a posture. I'm going to give it a chance.
I was like, you're going to pick it up?
Yep.
He's a bit of a flirt, but I'm going to give it a chance. It took you a second, though. It took you a second for sure. All right, well, quoting Hamilton, sneaky quoting Hamilton, trying to sneak a Hamilton quote past each other is our favorite thing, but also...
Doing this podcast is our favorite thing. Doing this podcast is our favorite thing.
You just rolled with it today. You
did. I completely... I didn't stutter.
Bulldozed.
Yep. We can redo that again if you want to cut that out.
That's fine. That's pretty funny. So
I never do that.
I'll just go, thing.
There you go.
Favorite Things is a segment of our show where we share with you the thing that we're excited about, the thing we either discovered this week, rediscovered this week, or are just in generally stoked on, in hopes primarily that you might try to either recreate the circumstances or just find the thing we're talking about and recommending, so that you might find your next favorite thing. So mine is eminently shareable, and since you bulldozed me on the song intro, I will go ahead and start today. Cobra Kai on Netflix. I'm not even going to mince words here. Just Cobra Kai on Netflix is better than it has any right to be. It is a TV show based on that is the same continuity, the same universe and continuity as 1984's Karate Kid, and which is admittedly just like the cheesiest like 80s like kid action movie that I grew up with. Obviously, I loved it as a kid. You know, I grew up a child of the 90s, grew up watching Karate Kid for sure. It was already a classic by the time I was growing up in the 90s.
Hold up. You said the cheesiest. I will counter that.
Okay, there are
Three Ninjas.
No,
Three Ninjas. Have you ever watched Three Ninjas?
I'm sure, but what I meant is it's like quintessential 80s cheese is probably what I should have said. But nevertheless, it was still a remarkable movie. The Pat, I forget the guy's name, but the guy who played Mr. Miyagi, like he won an Academy Award for his performance, but still kind of just like, in my mind, the quintessential like 80s teen movie. So they like have made a TV show. So the original cast, Ralph Macchio, who played Daniel LaRusso, and William Zabka, who played Johnny Lawrence, his rival, they came back now. It's I guess it was 2018 or 2019 when the show came out, but they came back and did a TV show that is basically these characters now as grown-ups, raising the next generation of karate kids in California. And it's really good. I will just say that like they've taken the sort of ideas, the foundation of what the show was in the 80s, and they've iterated on it in a way that makes it just a compelling television show for adults in 2020. It's so good. So it's on Netflix. Cobra Kai is the name of the show. Even if you're not, my wife was not a Karate Kid fan. She had never seen the movie, or she had seen it only a couple times. Very, very, very little knowledge of it. They show flashbacks using the original footage. Again, they have all the same actors, and they hold your hand through the context you need to know. So it's still a good show, even if you're not a Karate Kid fan. I'm just saying, go check it out. It's amazing.
I loved Karate Kid.
Crazy show.
I can't remember anything because I have terrible memory, but that movie was fantastic.
Yeah. Go check it out. You'll like have flashbacks to it once you like see all the like when they show you the flashbacks, and you're like, oh yeah, I remember that.
Nice.
Really, really good show. So I literally, I mean, I know I've made plenty of show recommendations on this, but this is one that I'm like it's a must watch for sure.
Didn't that show start as a YouTube TV exclusive?
Something like that. They had like a really low budget, and like again, it was kind of like a pet project from William Zabka, who played the rival. You know what I mean? So he kind of wanted, in a way, to tell that character's story, but then he would not. You know, you don't want to then paint the main character Daniel LaRusso in like a negative light necessarily, but you still want to show like the kind of complex character. It took like very one-dimensional characters and turns them into three-dimensional characters that have incredible depth. And neither of them are like incredibly stellar performers, but they're both good at, like, they both are well beyond what they were when they were kids performing the movie. Nice. So it's great. Yeah. Just go check it out is all I'm saying. So that's my favorite thing, Cobra Kai.
All right. My favorite thing is, due to work scheduling conflicts and family scheduling conflicts, I have now moved my weekly long run to Saturday morning. And I thought it would be a bad thing because I love kicking off my Fridays with a very early in the morning, 1.5 to 2.5 hour run. And then knowing I can kick off that's the weekend. Like all the hard running is done for the week. And it's Friday, I'm at work and I have a great day. And I just kind of don't really worry about things. Well, I moved it to Saturday now, and I had the exact same experience, but now moved to Saturday morning, and it was absolutely incredible. I was shown a different route, so I had to run for over 2 hours out in the middle of a battlefield here. It's one of the things about Spotsylvania that's actually appealing to the world, is that we are a major historical relevant Civil War battlefield area, so there's lots of sites and trails and wooded places where you can go see all of the different battles, where they have reenactments, where there's cannon set up and props and all this cool stuff if you're into the Civil War kind of history. And I was able to run in an entirely new environment on a Saturday morning at a new time, and it was invigorating and absolutely incredible, and it just kicked off an amazing weekend. Right after that, my wife had a lunch thing going on downtown by herself. She could not take the kids, so I kept both boys here and decided to have a kind of celebratory post long run cookout where I grilled some cheeseburgers and I bought these pumpkin ales and just hung out on the back deck. The weather was beautiful and we had a great time, just the three of us, Bowen boys. It was great. So that was kind of my favorite thing, was the long run followed by the cookout, and just an amazing experience all around. Definitely energizing and refreshing.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Sweet. Cool. Well, then that moves us on to our next segment, which is DLC. All right, DLC for the day. I wanted to continue. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about what it would look like to design a Penguin and Termite video game. And so I want to continue with that theme. Now that we're talking about game endings, I want to say in a hypothetical Penguin and Termite game that we had previously designed, where it was kind of like, I think we had talked about it being like kind of like a Diablo style top down, swapping between the characters, action RPG, and what would the ending of that game look like? That is DLC for the day. So discuss this DLC.
Are you setting me up here? Because we've had this discussion before. You know what kind of endings I like. My kind of endings, and if this is our game with Penguin and Termite in it, it will have a ridiculously longer than Death Stranding epilogue.
No way.
It will have an amazing, it'll tie every question up. It will answer absolutely everything with complete certainty and no doubt whatsoever.
Yeah,
every
you can
character
do that.
arc.
You can do that in there's no way a Penguin and Termite game with our goofy characters is going to be like an Academy Award winning, incredibly lore rich, deep experience. It's going to be like a goofy, fun Battletoads style story, and it's going to need no more than 30 minutes to wrap up. So I'll give you 30 minute and long ending.
Well, the fun part about what you just said is 30 minutes to wrap up a game like that is a long epilogue. Yeah,
fair.
So I'll take it. I'll take your 30 minutes.
It's definitely going to have one of those things. It's good. Gotta have. I'm a sucker for post credit teasers. So it's going to have a post credit teaser that teases Penguin and Termite 2.
Yep. See, I can get behind that. I love post credit stuff. I'm all in. I mean, Marvel Cinematic Universe has just set me up, conditioned me, made me excited for and expect like post-credit scenes about what could possibly happen in the future, to speculate like, what does that mean?
What would it be?
I can't wait to go look that up.
What it would be is you would see a letter floating on the wind, just like an envelope, and the wind will turn it around, and what you'll see is the red wax logo of the Smash Bros. That everyone associates with Smash Bros.
Ooh,
and it will gently fall right there at the foot of Termite. And as he turns around, the wind blows it away. as he reaches for it, is that what I think it is? And then it blows away. And they're not actually.
It's like a Hogwarts invitation. Exactly. It's so big. It's such a big deal. It's like, we're going to go into Smash. And then nope.
Nope.
Not at all.
Nope. Troll.
And then it goes to Penguin, and he gets the exact same thing. The exact same piece of paper blows across the county over to Penguin's shoes. And he picks it up. And then it gets struck by lightning, and it's shattered. Not him, the paper. The paper gets struck by lightning, and Penguin scares away backwards, like no, and jumps away behind to save his life, and the paper is fried.
I like the idea of the ashes in his hands falling as he looks in the sky and goes, no! That's like the post credit. There's the post credit teaser that sets up the next game, and then the post credit teaser that's a Smash troll. Perfect, beautiful, wonderful. That is it. If you want, tell us your 80-bit Pod Smash or Penguin and Termite, perfect Penguin and Termite game endings. If such a game were to exist, what would the ending look like? If you have your own ideas as to what like your personal game would be based on your gamer tag and your experiences and proclivities, then what would the ending of that game look like? So you can share all that with us. Either directly, you can send us a message, a DM, you can talk to us about it on Discord, or you can chat us up on Reddit, is probably another great place to have those discussions. I will post a discussion post about it when this episode goes live. So yeah, Termite, where else can the Pod Smashers of the internet find us?
All of those things you mentioned, you can find links to at 80bitpodsmash.com, 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website with links to all of our podcast platforms. You can find our RSS feed there to throw it into any third-party app. We're also on twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash. We go live Mondays and Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Eastern for both our news show on Mondays and our game streams on Wednesdays. There's our social media platforms that we are available on: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit. You can find subreddits. Our threads are created with every episode, every topic, so you can have a discussion with the community asynchronously. And we also have a Discord server if you're into a live conversation. And the link to our Discord server is in all of our show notes, as well as some of our social media posts. And there's a link on our website. So 80bitpodsmash.com is your spot for everything.
Awesome. Cool. All right, then. That leads us into our main topic, which, again, we are talking about game endings. What is considered the ending of a game is kind of like, when can you say that I have reached the end of the game? And again, that is a laden question. Many ways that is personal to yourself. Like what one might consider the end of the game is not necessarily what another considers the end of a game, but kind of what is sort of the built-in endings that people provide. So that's where we'll start. What is considered the ending of a game? How do games end, and how are game endings different than other forms of entertainment?
I did not look up a definition of this, but I've always understood it as people say on the internet, I have rolled credits.
Yep. I was going to say credits are almost ubiquitous across the industry as like, cool, you hit the credits.
I mean, you could take an old NES game. It's like a side-scrolling airplane shooter without a single word of dialogue, and you rolled credits on it. That's the ending of that game. And it can be no story at all. It can be full of story. It can be Death Stranding levels of depth and dialogue and cutscenes. And I use Death Stranding because it's like the epitome of like a crazy long 2.5 hour ending before the credits. But it's that moment you hit the credits, you've seen the ending of the game.
Right. It may not even be the end of the content. There may still be content left for you to do, or trophy. Again, we're not talking necessarily about trophies here. We're not even talking about like 100% in games. We're just talking about what's the ending. And again, that one person might say, "Oh, cool, I rolled the credits," but it's not the end of the game for me.
Exactly.
But it's still typically, and many people would still agree, like, oh, you've reached the end of the game. I mean, even rolling credits though is not necessarily like a ubiquitous thing. Like I remember a lot of Blizzard games, for example. I think of like Diablo. I don't think Diablo, when you reach the end, when you killed Diablo, you saw there was a final cinematic, but I don't think there were credits. I think the credits were built into the menu. Like you'd say, okay, I want to see who's credits. So that became a thing too.
Yep.
It's not, again, that's not quite as ubiquitous, but it is something that I have seen before where like, yeah, nope, they don't make you watch the credits unless you willingly choose to look at the credits, and there's an option in the menu for it. So, that's so how are they different? How are endings different than how are video game endings? How can they be different from other forms of media?
You shed a little content on that. Sorry, shed a light on that. I'm looking at the word content in my notes. Sorry. You shed a light on that when you said like the ending of a game could be different for different people, because just because you've reached the end of the story or the main content of the game doesn't mean the game is over, as far as is there anything else to explore, anything else to do, any more trophies or achievements to collect. And that's extremely unique to video games. Like when you finish a book, it's the last page and you shut the back cover. There's not like suddenly a mysterious second half of the book that appears in your hand. Like that's it. Like you've reached the end of a book.
Or like
a movie.
Inside the cover,
you're like, what?
Peel it back,
where did this come from?
Suddenly these like hidden pages with tiny script. That's an entirely additional little novella. Yeah, that would be ridiculous.
And like movies and TV shows are very linear. You know, there's a very firm beginning and end, and that's it. Like they can come out with new seasons or like sequels or that kind of stuff.
Did you know, by the way? Sorry, complete side note. I learned this recently, and I was blown away by it. The word trailer, like trailers for other movies, trailers used to come after the credits on the movie. Like trailers used to come, that's why they're called trailers, because they trail behind the movie. So you'd go see your movie, and then at the end there would be all these previews for other movies that you might want to watch, but they realized that people weren't sticking around to watch them. So they moved them to the front, but the name trailer comes from trailing behind and just kind of stuck. So sorry, that's
cool. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Cool fact.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, how are game endings different from other forms of media? That's a very practical way that video games are unique.
And also as you kind of hit on in one of our other questions, like video game endings can have different endings, kind of choose your own adventure pop-up style. Like there's very few things that actually do. There are other forms of media that do that, obviously, like the choose your own adventure books and stuff like that. But it's definitely something that's very common in video games. It's not very common in other forms of media. The idea of the end game, the EverQuest, again, we will also talk about that. That is later in the episode, but that is something too you don't see that in other forms of media. You will see sequels. You could see ad nauseum sequels to things.
Right.
One could argue in many ways that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is a kind of EverQuest, but that is, that again, that's something that too is way more common in video games. And even so, like there are still entries in like even though there are like entries in movies and stuff, there's nothing quite as robust as like the game that just doesn't end, that constantly. And I guess the installments and the episodes in that format would be new content drops. But definitely something that's way more. You don't see it as often. Usually, most movies, books, television shows are they have a limited run and a story they're trying to tell in that limited run, and not try to keep the story going forever. So
the last thing I'll say, answering that makes things unique to the player, is because video games are interactive. The player it's an active action for the player. Is that endings are unique in the form of, if they are good, they will give you a different payoff. They will give you a different satisfaction of finishing because you have put so much time into it. Like an average video game,
there's a level of skill. You don't have to have any skill to watch a movie and reach the ending. You may have to have some skill to get the movie, depending on what movie it is. But like to literally just sit there and watch it and reach the ending, there's no actual skill involved. As opposed to a video game, it's an exercise in skill. I will say that ties in nicely to my other point, which was there are some games that don't actually have story, don't actually have a narrative, so you're not getting a narrative payoff at the end, but you might get, I've reached the end and gotten the high score or whatever, especially with the older arcade games and stuff like that. So that is a form of ending too. So
the average video game is like, you can spend more time playing a single video game than over 3 movies. So like the length of an average game today is more than 3 movies worth of content. So you've invested some time into this medium, into this thing, a single game, and designers and writers need to make that time spent worth it. And like, if you spent that much time playing a game and then all of a sudden your character just dies at the end and that's the ending, like what kind of payoff would that be? It would be very frustrating. So that's kind of a different aspect of
genius.
I mean, yeah, I guess it depends on the context of the story. Like, yeah, because that could be an amazing ending too.
Right. Yeah.
But that's what makes
like
video games
Halo
unique
Reach, yo.
Yeah, how about that? Yeah. Yep.
Sorry, spoilers for Halo Reach, I guess.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, great. Then I guess we can move on to our next question, which is what are some of the different ways that games end? Not just the stories themselves, like not just like, oh yeah, these are common story beats. I mean, actually, like, what are ways that games kind of like bring you to the culmination that would include the gameplay aspects of it? So I think you already answered that, and I see in your notes. So and then we'll talk about kind of how are some of these endings advantageous or problematic from the perspective of the players.
And this is where we have to table our discussion for our audience and tell them we're going to be talking about a bunch of different games and a bunch of examples of endings.
Yeah.
Some details could come out. We are apologetic for spoilers for these things. I'm trying not to reference modern games in my notes.
Yeah, that's a good call. Yep.
Stuff from this generation is on the table. I won't go into details about things that have come out this year, but just in the history of games, if there's something you haven't played and you're afraid we're going, by mentioning the title, that we might spoil the ending, I don't know what to tell you to do, because we're just going to be bouncing around with good examples, bad examples, and different stuff. So just be on alert. Most of this stuff is older generation things, so we should be safe as far as the statute of limitations on spoiling endings for games that are old.
Limitations. Yep, sounds
like
good.
That?
That's a good disclaimer. Yeah. I like it. All right.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I wish we had a nice timestamp to be like skip ahead to
Yeah, we don't, because this whole topic is about endings. So
exactly. So yeah. Cool. Well, that's a good way to be like, all right, cool, great. That is our spoiler disclaimer. So proceed at your own risk. But cool. All right, hit us up.
So different ways that games can end. Some examples. Games usually end in big set piece escape sequences. We have seen that in more modern games, starting kind of with the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube era in the early aughts through now, where we had, and I'm referencing Halo 1 through like all of the Halos, where all of the games end with this crazy Hogwarts, wow. Warthog. the Warthog escape scenes where everything's blowing up, the orchestral music is at its crescendo, and there's explosions, and the enemies are all over the place, and it's just this big, awesome theatric experience, and it's usually a climax of the story, of the game, of everything you've seen and loved. That's one example. Another is... did you want to say anything about that?
No, I was going to segue right into the next one, which is so I'll just take it from you. Baton pass.
Yeah, get it.
And big boss fight. Boss fights are kind of the other side of that coin.
Yep.
The way I see it, like most games either end with some kind of like wave based, like you are. So usually it's a final test of your skills, all the skills you've gotten to that point. Usually, I won't say in all cases, but usually it's kind of a test of your skills. So it's the hardest fight, the hardest puzzle, the hardest race, all that stuff, whatever it is you're doing. And like you said, in the early aughts and throughout, all the way up to the early 2010s as well, it was like they added that idea of like, your character's got to escape from a collapsing temple. I'm looking at you, Uncharted.
Right.
And again, it's usually a visual spectacle, but you see that in the boss fights too. They're often visual spectacles. But and oftentimes those bosses, again, they're a test of all the skills you've gotten up to that point. They're usually the biggest bad, the person or thing or entity or god that you hate the most, and you are bringing them down in order to save the world. We're talking about big stakes here. In almost all cases, is usually it's game endings are games. To put it in terms of narrative, we talked about the climactic story arc in our episode about plot. And usually games usually end at the climax and then usually have a cutscene or two that wrap up the resolution part of that, with some exceptions such as Death Stranding and Metal Gear Solid and some of these games that have long cinematic finales that are often included in the resolution. But that big final fight, that big gameplay moment, the last time you got your hands on the controller, usually is the true climax of the story. And boss fights. The other way I started seeing it be handled in some cases, instead of like a single boss that you fight, a lot of games will just have you fight like waves of the enemies.
Yep.
I think of BioShock 2. I think BioShock 1 got a lot of criticism because it didn't really have bosses throughout. So to suddenly have a boss in the end of the game that you had to fight in a completely different way than you fought anything else in the game was a little jarring to people. So they answered that in BioShock 2. They're like, well, we'll just have you fight waves and waves of enemies in sort of a survival round. And that is how we'll test your skills. So that's the way I saw it start to be handled. I think that's sort of carried through in a bunch of games as well.
Yeah, I know, like a lot of Mega Man games at the end, when you're in Wily's castles in the early Mega Man games, or in the later ones like Mega Man X, you're in Sigma's place. Almost all of them end with a boss. You have to fight all 8 bosses in the game back to back. And they give you limited health between each one and limited ammo and resources, with the expectation of you've already beaten these bosses. You should know how they fight. You should know their patterns. You should know the mechanics of the game. So it's kind of that culmination of all the skills you should have using all the mechanics the game has introduced for one big final challenge. And boss waves kind of do that, especially if the character in the game has leveled up or acquired abilities. You have to learn as a player how to use all that stuff and like get over that hump.
Yeah. So what are kind of some of these what are the advantages and disadvantages of these kinds of different game endings? I would say that, like, kind of what I touched on with BioShock is, like, if you have a game that doesn't really have a lot of bosses in it, where they are already kind of like setting the expectation of like, oh yeah, like now I have to do a boss fight where I have to, Zelda's a great example of a game that does bosses well, because it's like you get an item or some kind of piece of equipment in the dungeon where the boss is, and then you have to use that against the boss. It's kind of the culmination of like, we are testing your skill with the Megaton hammer or the bow or whatever, the hook shot, whatever it is that you got. Like, we're testing your skill with that. And then the final boss is usually like, now you have to use all of these pieces of equipment at certain points to beat this boss. And that doesn't really happen in all these. There's a lot of games that are designed that doesn't have that happen in. I think of a lot of like narrative first-person shooters, like BioShock. They don't really do that throughout the game, or some of them don't. Right. So to have it, yeah, you definitely. I think that one of the answers to that was the kind of gauntlet, the survival wave version of the boss fight, if you will. And that's also, though, sometimes unsatisfying. Like the disadvantage of that, the advantage is like, cool, you get to fight all the things you've been fighting, just like, waves of different combinations of them. But at the same time, there's nothing like when you're fighting that big final boss, it definitely has a narrative payoff that I think can be lost in the alternative. So one kind of emphasizes player skill and difficulty.
And I think the advantage of that is a great payoff, a reward for like, I've achieved this thing, I've beaten everything in the game, and I've shown my skill is worth it. The disadvantage to that is if you can't finish it all quickly and you come back to the game later after some time has spent, you might not be able to pick up those mechanics again, and you kind of lose the refined skill that is required to finish that boss gauntlet or that crazy ending. Like, if you put down Zelda and you come back and you have to use all these items again, you got to figure out like, oh, what are they used for again? Maybe that's
definitely
a problem for kind of an ending.
There was something I saw on Reddit that was like, I want a mode. Someone posted this in the gaming subreddit. It was all over Reddit for like a month or so, and I loved the idea. And I think I mentioned it on the podcast, but it's worth mentioning here, which is the because of what you just brought up. But it was something called like, I want a mode in video games that's called I am a grown adult, and I sometimes have to put games down for a long period of time, and sometimes I would like a refresher as to how this game is played when I pick it up. So like a mode that would basically be like, we detected based on the internal clock of the system that you haven't played this game in a few months. Would you like a quick refresher as to like where you are in the story and how the basic game is played?
Yes,
would you like that would be amazing. Yeah, that would be incredible.
I just experienced that with the Outer Worlds that I haven't touched since May, and now it's September. And I have no clue where I am in the story. I don't know where I am. I don't know what planet I'm on. I don't know what my build is. I don't know what's going on. I don't even know how to use stuff like grenades or how to, like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm in the middle of the game. Could you imagine if I was at the end? Like, it'd be that much harder.
Yeah. The other kind of major way that games do or don't end in this, as the case may be, is just that. Like, some games don't really have the traditional ending. They'll have campaigns that have many endings throughout them, usually kind of wrapping up a narrative at hand, but with that sort of Marvel Cinematic Universe idea of like, but we'll also tease the next big thing that's coming to the characters. Obviously, MMOs do this. Games as a service things became very popular in the late 2000s and has solidified its popularity in modern times in the 2010s, and we'll probably continue to see it in this decade, which is the idea that like no, this game is meant to capture your attention, so they're going to have regular content drops. So they're going to be telling sort of episodic stories that are meant to keep you hooked to the game. And yeah, like I said, this was pioneered in MMOs. I think of World of Warcraft and I'm like, yeah, the original WoW, vanilla WoW, did not really have an ending. It was just like, I mean, there was an end to the content that you had in any given patch cycle, but like there was no like roll credits, it's time for the ending, like great, you did it. You beat them, like it was almost always just like, cool, you beat that boss, you got some loot, and now go farm some more so that you can get prepared for the next round of content that we're going to drop on you. Mm-hmm. And they got better with crafting the narrative as expansions went on. But I mean, I always will think of that as sort of the quintessential, like, game that never ends. Just, it's always, they always set that expectation of, like, there's going to be another thing for you to do, and that can be tedious, of course, for a lot of people. But Destiny kind of continues that now today. Like, Destiny is another quintessential example of that, where it's like, yeah, sure, there was the campaign, there was the Red War campaign when Destiny 2 dropped that told a story beginning, middle, end. But then it was like they teased the next bit of content, and then they constantly are like, cool, like now they keep bringing you back. Now, oh, now you have to face this challenge, Guardian. Now you have to face this challenge, Guardian. That definitely, it has its advantages, especially from a developer standpoint. Like they can continue to keep you hooked and keep making money off of you, keep that subscription, or keep having you buy the content.
Mm-hmm.
But it can be problematic in its own way of like the game doesn't feel like it ever ends, and I always feel like I'm coming back to it and still having to like have to re-get back into this story or re-get back into these mechanics, and it can definitely be problematic, I think, in many ways. So
and that's definitely unique to video games, like the never-ending games as a service, The Division, Destiny,
and yet they rely
Rainbow
on
Six Siege,
tried and true narrative devices such as, and you have the note here, such as cliffhangers.
Yep.
Cliffhangers are constant, almost, I shouldn't say constant, but almost constant to be expected. I think of cliffhanger endings. You use the example of Halo 2.
Oh my gosh. Halo 2's egregious. It's egregious. Like, totally, we have planned Halo 3 before we finished Halo 2, and everything about this game is going to point to you guys buying the next one. Yeah. It was so bad.
At the risk of, I won't say what the plot point is, at the risk of people who may not have played this 2018 title, but the end of God of War 4 was also a pretty big cliffhanger too, where it's like, oh my gosh, this thing and this entity has just shown up, and how are Kratos and Atreus going to deal with this?
Wasn't that a hidden ending?
I don't remember. I think you had to go, there was like, because there was a roll credits moment, and then it was like, I guess it was hidden in the sense that like, the credits rolled at the end of the traditional end of the game, and then they gave you one final quest, which was just go back to your house. Like, you and Atreus go back to your house, and yes, you didn't get the ending until you actually did that. But it was also built into the game, like, it would be hard to miss, I think. Either way, it was, yes.
Oh, yeah, okay. You'll find a button prompt near the beds of Kratos and Atreus. It's a small house. The prompt isn't hard to find. Once there, you can choose to go to sleep for the first time since your adventure began, and doing so will trigger.
Oh, that's crazy! I didn't realize. Yeah, that would have been the first time they slept. But yeah, so and that's another good point. Hidden endings, hidden alternate endings, and stuff like that. Like that is we kind of hit on. We didn't in this question. We didn't hit on the idea of alternate endings, where choices you make in the game or certain things that you trigger in the game may result in a different ending. So two people could play through the same game thinking they've reached the same ending, only to have different endings. That is something that it's cool because it encourages multiple playthroughs, but it's also problematic for people who are just like, I don't want to play through the game all over again. So that is thank the Lord that YouTube is a thing, because like I remember finding out there were like 8 different endings for BioShock, and I'm like, nah, it's cool. I'll just YouTube all the different endings.
And I finished Far Cry 3 pretty recently, and apparently there was 2 different endings for that. And I chose one, and I was like, oh, there's another one? So I just YouTubed the other one, and I was like, oh my gosh, okay. Yeah, I'm glad I picked what I did. And then like Mass Effect 3 is famous. I never played it, but Mass Effect 3 is infamous for its quote terrible ending. Like, I don't know because I haven't played it, but apparently thousands of decisions, dozens of hours of gameplay, non-linear experience of a lifetime culminated in your choice of a either red, blue, or green ending, and it's super shallow, but it has that choice, so it is different for everyone who chooses those things. But that was problematic because it was both too short, unrewarding, maybe it could have been cool that it had 3 different endings, but yeah, so that's another one.
Yeah. I'm going to skip the examples because we've already given some good examples of different kinds of endings. And instead, I want to ask the question I would rather spend my time here, which is what are some of the factors that go into designing endings? So it's both writers who have to write whatever narrative frames the ending, whatever payoffs, narratively speaking, but also developers who have to design whatever content it is, whatever boss fight, gauntlet or survival wave kind of ending or non-ending as the case of Endgame may be. So what are different factors that have to go into those decisions? And if you want to bring some of your good bad examples from that you had in your notes from the previous question that I nixed, then feel free to do that in any of these next few questions. So cool.
I really feel like we know enough about The Last of Us Part 2 that we can stay both spoiler free and appreciate all the different factors the developers had to do to keep the ending the way that it was. I think that's a perfect example that hits on a myriad of different topics. So The Last of Us Part 2 it goes back to the intent of what the content is going to be. So if you're going to go and set out to make a game like Destiny, what you're going to keep in mind when designing the ending of that game is going to be vastly different than if you're trying to create a single player narrative experience with a beginning, middle, and end like The Last of Us Part 2. The reason why I want to highlight that game is because there was an entire character that was kept hidden from everyone. There was fake content made and shown off to mislead everyone. All of that was built into designing the ending of that game, the climax of the game, and the characters and the narrative. And that made for an extraordinarily rewarding experience and a very deep and meaningful story with crazy, this could be discussed in academia for video game design when it comes to these things. And that's why I wanted to highlight that. So endings as they should be narratively satisfying. That's definitely The Last of Us Part 2.
Sure, yeah.
They should flow with the results of the player's actions, but that's what's cool about The Last of Us Part 2 and the first one, Parts 1, is that you would think the player would have agency and control, but no, they actually defy the player's actions and give the player the story that they're boldly trying to state and have input, and the player be darned regardless of what they want and succumb themselves to this amazing story and actually adds depth and meaning.
There's definitely something to be said about putting you behind the wheels of a character who's making choices, not having you, the player, make choices. And both are valid. Both are valid designs, right? Yeah. There are great games that have alternate endings. I do think of the original BioShock and the ending you can either earn by sparing the little sisters or killing the little sisters, and the different endings you can earn in that regard. I think that gives you some depth because it gives you some agency over it. But there's something to be. But that there was a point at which that design became kind of rote. Okay, cool, there's going to be multiple endings for this based on my choices, blah, blah, blah. We've done this before. So then to go all the way in the other direction and say, nope, it's going to happen whether you like it or not, and your only choice is to turn the game off and put it away that's the only agency you have if you don't like where this is going. But there's something to be said about, again, games allowing you, because you're the one behind the wheel, you can empathize with the characters that are making choices that may be different from the ones that you may have made in those same circumstances. So it's definitely those are two equally valid things there.
But my point in highlighting all of that was just that it starts from the very beginning of developing and writing a game.
Yeah,
how you design the ending, it starts with everything, with its intention, with its audience, with its financial goals in mind, what the publisher has funded you to do if you're a dev studio. I mean, all of that stuff that we talk about on the show that seems like maybe not gaming related when it comes to industry and decisions that have to please shareholders. All of that stuff is in mind when you're designing the ending of a game.
Right. And you also have to...
relevant.
Yeah, for sure. And you have to... as a developer, they have to consider too, is the ending of... kind of what we hit on earlier. Is the ending of the game a completely different flow, a completely different set of skills than what we've been training our people to do, our players to do this whole time. So if they're going to end the game on a big boss, maybe consider including other bosses throughout the game to give players a build up towards and to test their skills throughout. so that they know that there's going to be one big final test of skills and they're ready for that, as opposed to just dropping the test of skills on them seemingly out of nowhere. So there's lots of games that do that well, but there are some examples of games that do that poorly. I also think of there are plenty of games, there are a lot of game developers, I think, that are scared of the idea of the open-ended ending, which is the ending that is up to interpretation. And one of the classic examples of this is, I know there's a modern example you and I just recently discussed, but I want to talk about a classic example of this, and that is the ending of what is widely considered in many circles the best game of all time, which is Ocarina of Time.
Yep.
So to spoil a game from 1998.
Yep, 98.
The ending, at the very end, you beat Ganondorf. Zelda sends you back in time, thus using the Ocarina, thus creating the multiple timelines of the Zelda universe. And then the very one of the very last shots and very last scenes of the game is Navi, your fairy companion who has been with you the entire time and who you grew to love, maybe love-hate, depending on how old you were when you played the game. But, your fairy companion, your best friend, the person who's the intelligence and spirit that's been with you the entire game, flies off and leaves poor Link forever, fueling an entirely other game, which again ended up becoming one of the best entries in the Zelda franchise, but still not answering the question, where did Navi go and why did she leave? You don't know. You're not given those answers. She just flies away and she's gone, and it's left open to the interpretation of the player as to what motivated that, why, and then you the player end up feeling like Link. Why did she leave me? You know what I mean? Why did who ultimately started the entire character that started this journey by showing up in the first place, why did she leave? Crazy, incredibly good ending. One of the more profound storytelling moments in Zelda, I think, period. Especially for someone, I was 8 years old when I played that game for the first time. And having to wrestle and grapple with that idea as an 8-year-old and be exposed to that, formed the foundation for emotions that I would have to handle in my adult life, being I may never understand why such person may have done this thing that was harmful to me, but I may never get those answers. And you as a person have to figure out how to deal with that. And that was introduced in a game when I was 8 years old. To me in a game, that feeling, that emotion of being okay, I'm never going to get an answer to this. And how do you deal with that as a person? What? A Zelda game did that? A Zelda game that up to this point has had one of the most straightforward one-dimensional stories of all time. Save the princess, kill the monster, and then deal with loss, deal with a friend leaving you and never giving you an explanation why. What? Crazy.
Yep. And then comes Majora's Mask, where your
which is even more open-ended.
Yep. Yeah, then you're really, really blowing the doors off Pandora's box as far as your emotional reaction to a video game.
Specifically explores with the idea of loss and coming to terms with tragedy.
Yep.
Yeah, again, and you think you play that game, you're wow, this is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time. Maybe we'll finally get the answers we want. Nope. Instead, we're just going to teach you. We're going to give you an example as to how to deal with this very loss. It's crazy. Just both Zelda, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask are just storytelling masterpieces. And crazy good endings, I think. They further the ambiguity by having Link show up to Zelda in the past, young Link and young Zelda looking at each other, and that's the final shot of the game. Again, left up to even more interpretation, but there's a certain there's something to be said about game endings that ask more questions than provide answers, and a depth that can create not only for future titles to explore and play with, but also just the idea of it's okay to leave players with questions. It's okay to leave your audience with questions. And I think there are some game developers that love that, and there are some that don't love that and want to give solid answers and are don't worry, any questions we ask will be answered in the next one. It's no, it's okay to just be okay, that was left up to my interpretation. So, and
then going back to the financial angle, are we planning more than one game in this entry? Is this a universe? Do we want to leave it open on purpose to encourage players to want to play our next game that hasn't been announced yet? Is this a new IP? Is it an established IP? An established universe? I mean, there's all these other questions to ask when you're keeping in mind when you're designing the ending of a game.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think about, I just finished Control, so it's fresh on my mind. You talk about open-ended stuff, lots of extra questions, drove me insane because I'm a person who loves long epilogues. As I talked about, I like every dot or every I dotted, every T crossed. I want every aspect of the story to be told to me. Any ambiguity just leaves me in a pit of confusion and uncertainty, and I don't like living there. But that is player preference. That is my preference. But from a writing perspective,
I love that I forced you into that. Then,
yeah,
it's like the ultimate counterpoint to Death Stranding, which Death Stranding answered every possible question and nuance that you'd ever want out of the story, and in a powerful and compelling way. Don't get me wrong; it wasn't just like exposition; it was like really interesting stuff. But then you have Control, where it's just like, it was weird. It was meant to be weird. And like, again, they too open up the door for the possibility of exploring more in the future, because the entire premise is this government organization that researches the paranormal and the strange and the extra dimensional. So there's all kinds of possibilities. There's an entire multiverse of possibilities that opens up for future entries. But like, they also don't give clear cut answers. And I love that. I personally love it.
It is in the same universe as Alan Wake, which is a previous entry. So it's like allows you to have that kind of weird, obfuscated connection between two games that might exist in the same universe and affect each other, but in a ambiguous way. And then you can as a development studio, that would be Remedy, or as a publisher, 505 Games, like you now have all this kind of these assets to play with, and you have a lot of flexibility in what kind of game you're going to put out next. And you've already enticed your audience to want to try it when it comes out. So
and you haven't locked yourself into like one genre or one single story. Like you've opened yourself up to possibly going a completely different direction with it, and there's something satisfying about that, in my opinion.
And the opposite of that are games like the Halo franchise and Gears of War. Now there's 4 and 5 entries on each of those franchises, and they're very linear first-person shooters, third-person shooter respectively, and they have like, they got to stay within, like, there's bounds. Like Halo has, what does it take to be a Halo game? Master Chief, Warthogs, Covenant.
You know, a game spelled that out. You know, it's a game that spelled that out in a way that like actually is kind of compelling, but also like, okay, well, you've locked yourself into this. BioShock Infinite, which had one of the best endings of any game of all time, like mind blowing. I remember I had to like digest that game. I didn't play a single game for like a week after beating that game, because I just wanted to think about it. In the research of
doing this episode, so many websites cited BioShock Infinite as a terrible ending. That's hilarious.
Yeah, people love it or hate it. But one of the things that, like, I personally thought the ending was awesome. But one of the things they introduced was the idea of, like, there's always a man and there's always a city. Was kind of like the thing they've locked themselves. Like, they've made that part of the canon. Is like, in this multiverse of worlds where the story is playing out, like, the same story is kind of playing out, like, in a fractal, like, repeated across the multiverse. Like, that's what the thing that Elizabeth said, is there's always a man and there's always a city. And so they've kind of locked themselves into that now, as far as I'm concerned. Now, granted, it would be a cool twist if in BioShock 4 they made you play a woman, but the idea of, like, there's always a protagonist and there's always a city is something that they sort of a formula that they've locked themselves into. Yeah. That I think it's interesting the way they did it, but certainly maybe narrowing, maybe limiting to the storytellers as they go forward with that franchise. People didn't like the ending to BioShock Infinite. I love it.
It was like ubiquitous across multiple outlets that were like best endings and worst endings in video games, as I was collecting ideas for the show, and everywhere condemned the ending of BioShock Infinite a lot.
Blew my mind. People have weird opinions. It's fine. I'm fine being the minority on that. If you hate the ending of BioShock Infinite, come preach at me why, and I will try to. I
remember it being pretty awesome and like enthralling back when I finished it, but I had forgotten the ending.
We're the silent majority.
Yeah, I guess so. But when I read the ending this morning through these outlets, I was like, oh yeah, I guess I can see why that would be cheap and silly and weird. But I digress.
Whatever. Yeah, no, that's a complete digression. Let's pivot here and spend the rest of our time really quick talking about, because I promised we would talk about end game. What is the idea of the game that doesn't really end, but instead has content when you've reached what the traditional ending in a normal story would be, instead has more and more content? What is it, and why has it become an important piece of video game culture in the last couple of decades?
Yeah, I guess in the 2010s specifically, with the introduction of games like Destiny, games as a service, there is, and that stems off of MMOs, so that the pedigree of Destiny, which we see now being kind of solidified in the 2010s, began its way back. You could trace ties all the way back to like Ultima Online, Richard Garriott's Ultima, like way back. So anyway, I don't want to like separate that. MMORPGs, MMOs that constantly tacked on new content, subscription models, money trickling in, changing the game. Like those things happened and were established. Where it has gotten different in the modern era of gaming is like this shared world MMO light type of thing, where there are in-world events that happen live across the servers, and there is new loot and new gear, and like there's this shallow campaign. I say shallow in size and in length, where most of the game is spent grinding out challenges, dailies, weeklies to get better gear to fight the next big challenge, whether that's a raid boss or next piece of content like a dungeon that's added to the game. Destiny's been doing this for a while. The Division 1 and 2 on the realistic shooter side of things, that kind of evolved into the arena shooters like Rocket League and Overwatch, where there are constantly new maps being rotated in, new game modes, battle royales, PUBG, Fortnite taking over the world by storm. And like Fortnite's world changes all the time. They have in-game events, they have in-game videos, streams, live music, concerts, like crazy things are happening in video games that are connected to the internet in new ways, new, innovative, strange ways. And so like the end game is just a term for staying relevant, continuing to play a game and experiencing the new content as it comes in. Yeah,
it definitely came out of, I mean, it's definitely found its origins in MMOs. Before MMOs, like most RPGs, the leveling experience, and we talked about this in our episode on like various episodes on RPGs, we've talked about the idea of like leveling. It comes from D&D, where you level and progress your character, advance your character, gain experience points, and like that is the primary game. Like it's just meant to give you some progression to help you get stronger, to overcome the challenges. But once you reach that idea of max level or level cap, the game's you've probably already beaten the game, or the game is close to being over if you've reached the level cap. And many games still do this today. But what happened with MMOs is like they made the leveling portion of it a mini game, and maybe not a mini game, but it's a sub part of the game. You're expected to level first, and then you get to the real content. Then you can do the raids, the dungeons, the arenas, the PvP, the battlegrounds, all that stuff. And the leveling is just sort of like a barrier for you to get to the quote end game, which is actually the real game in many cases. So yeah, that really came out. I mean, that was I was probably earlier than WoW, but like WoW was when I first experienced that, this idea that like, nope, the real game comes later, and that is the end game. And it's a very successful model. I mean, you can't deny that you might not like the end game model, but it's a successful one, right? Because what it does is video game designers eventually learned that selling one copy of a game is great, and then maybe you make another sequel to it and you can sell copies of those. But they found that you can make a lot more money over a sustained period of time if you keep people playing the same game they bought once. And there's different models for that. There's microtransactions that we see in free-to-play model games and stuff like that. But then there's all, which are super popular and by no means I want to write out, but there's also the subscription-based models, or the Destiny model, where you just buy the content. You continually buy the new content drops that they make for smaller amounts than the full game. Mm-hmm. But over time, they still make a lot of money. So, getting people to keep being engaged with that game, or maybe not consistently engaged, but to keep coming back to it, it just makes more money. And it's a model that, love it or hate it, works very, very, very well.
And the way video game development, it makes sense, because like you establish the engine you want to use, you create the assets, you work out everything up front, and that's the hard work that creates the game. Look at Borderlands 3, for example. You have Borderlands 3, it's established, you have all the voice acting, all the character models, the animation, you have the art assets, the textures, they're all in the game, they're ready to go. So then when you want to add content, now it's just write the story, get the voice actors, maybe you make one or two new models for new characters if you introduce new characters. If you don't, good. You can save all that money on the upfront cost and just create the extra content.
Churn it out.
And whether it's trickle, and Destiny does the same thing. It's just like, here's a new map, so there's a little bit of new art,
new guns. Acting. They may do some new coding and have to do some testing in that regard to make sure things are still balanced and stuff like that. But
it's nowhere near as much development as starting from scratch. And so it's a way to cheaply add content, sell it to the developer, sell it to the players, either through the subscription model or through the content a la carte. like Borderlands. But either way, you're making money on an established franchise by keeping players engaged.
Yep, cool. All right, let's finish off, talk about the future. How can game designers continue to iterate on game endings as we enter this new generation of gaming? Another way of putting it is like, what would you like to see? What would you like to see from game endings in the future? Of course, there's the immediate future of the next generation, and there's, of course, the long-term future. Just how would you like to see? What's something you aren't seeing a lot in games you want to see more of?
There are two avenues of gaming that are growing very aggressively. Sony is bringing the single-player AAA, almost like it's getting ridiculous. They want to call it quadruple A experience. It is the top-quality, high-budget, blockbuster video games with the ridiculously deep and challenging experiences. And that is emotionally, narratively deep. Last of Us Part 2 being the kind of example, the epitome of that aspect of what's happening in the gaming industry. So that's one. And where we're going to iterate on this is, I'll answer that in a second, but I want to establish where I'm going to go with this. So two big things are happening. One is on that front. The other one is the online connectivity and streaming. Whether it's both definitions of streaming. That is, you can access your games from any device, anywhere, on any medium. That's what Xbox is doing with their strategy with Game Pass and Project xCloud. And then there's the streaming on YouTube and Twitch, what used to be Mixer, but it's gone now. And Google is kind of touting it with YouTube and Stadia. And we're seeing the infancy of what is possible when you interact one player streaming to a crazy big player base. And so I think game design and designers are going to iterate on game endings to cater to those markets. What kind of game ending do you want to write for a game where somebody could be finishing your game on a subway, on a cell phone with earbuds? What kind of game ending do you want someone who has a full-blown Dolby Atmos 10 to 15 speaker setup? They're sitting in their home theater on their giant screen projector, 4K, that has all the best tech with their PlayStation 5. What kind of ending are you going to give them when they have the home theater experience? What kind of ending are you going to give the person who is streaming to 1,000 people online that want to give their audience agency and interactivity? It's actually three different aspects of gaming that we're seeing evolve in different ways. And I think all three of those are going to affect new ways to keep game endings as in a way that wants players to be satisfied and fulfilled. So as players are changing the paradigm for how they're satisfied and how they're fulfilled, those game endings are going to have to match.
Sure.
And so it's not really a personal preference so much as an observation on the gaming industry. But I think all three of those facets are going to change how games are designed and what their endings are going to imply.
Yeah, and those are really broad, but like you could continue to break those facets apart and just discover all kinds of, I mean, that's what's great about games is that like as the medium's evolving and deepening and you're having all these new great experiences, what you're going to find is that the way games continue to innovate and change the way they end across genres and across subgenres and sub-subgenres and all these new experiments are going to continue to, just continue to iterate. And so that's, again, I don't really have an answer beyond that. Just that, like, I think that I want to see them be more courageous with the kinds of endings they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm at a point in my life where, like, I do have the kinds of games that I'm shooting for. I mean, like, you just listen to all the episodes of our podcast and you'll get an idea for the kind of taste that I have, which is, in most cases, something to do with fighting, smashing, breaking, shooting, blasting, looting, and all kinds of those kinds of games. But like, I'm also open to all kinds of different varieties of games, and I have discovered that over the course of my not only doing this podcast, but just in the course of the last few years, is I do crave different experiences and different types of games, and becoming more open minded with the kinds of games I want. And endings will help that. If you tell me a game has a great ending, that is a motivator for me. So I will want to. It can be something that will actually fuel my purchases and stuff like that. So that's what I want to see. Is I want to see them continue. Again, new hardware and new technologies will just open up new possibilities as to what is possible, not only with games and narratives, but with the endings and how those games wrap up too. So yeah, I think that'll be interesting to see how. I want to see them. I just want to see them experiment more. You know what I mean? I don't want the industry to stagnate and being like, these are the three ways to end a game. I want to see more. Right. I want you to blow my mind and be like, boom, out of left field, like
didn't expect that.
A game can end like this too. So yeah, cool. All right, well, I feel like that's about all that we want to talk about. So I think that's where we'll stop to this Monday. And let us know what your thoughts are, listeners, Pod Smashers, friends and fans. Let us know what are your favorite game endings. What are you looking for in a game? What are you looking for personally in a game ending? What are games that have disappointed you? Do you like the EverQuest, the end game, the never-ending story, or do you just like? Are you the kind of person that's like, I don't want this game to end, so I'm just going to put it down and pretend like make my own ending up because I hate game endings. I hate the feeling of finishing a game and not having something else to pick up and entertain me. So we want to hear all those thoughts and more, anything you can possibly think about for game endings. And Termite, will you recap where they can find us?
Just go to 80bitpodsmash.com. That's our landing website. There's Discord server link there. There's a YouTube link there. Twitch.tv/80bitpodsmash for all of our live stream content. And pay attention to our social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit.
Awesome. Cool. Well, this is October. So this is the last week before Halloween week. And so next week on Monday, we will be doing our episode, our tradition of Monster Smash, which will be our main podcast episode. And we're going to be talking about ghost games this year. And then stay tuned Wednesday, not only this Wednesday that you're listening, then you will be seeing me streaming Resident Evil 3 Remake. But next week, after our Monster Smash episode drops, then on the Wednesday before Halloween, we will be streaming together live in person Silent Hill playable trailer, PT. So
PT, the most terrifying content in the world.
Yeah, for real. So that is all coming up next week. So check us out then.
See you next week.